Two countries, one region, and a war that nobody officially declared, but everybody is fighting. Right now, as you watch this, soldiers are dying in deserts they were never supposed to be in. Cities that were once alive with markets, music, and children playing in the streets are now rubble. Governments that looked strong 10 years ago have collapsed like sandcastles in a storm. And behind all of it, behind every single one of these disasters, two rivals are pulling strings, spending billions, and playing a game so dangerous that the entire Middle East is the board. This is not ancient history. This is not a religious war from 1,000 years ago. This is happening right now, and it has a geography, a map, that most people have never seen explained clearly. Once you understand this map, you will never look at Middle East news the same way again. So let's start from the very beginning. Let's talk about the two countries at the center of everything. On one side, you have Saudi Arabia, the largest country on the Arabian Peninsula, the home of Mecca and Medina, the two holiest cities in all of Islam, a kingdom sitting on the largest proven oil reserves on earth, a country where the king rules by religious authority, where the government follows a strict version of Sunni Islam called Wahhabism, and where for decades the royal family has used oil money to spread its religious and political influence across the entire Muslim world. On the other side, you have Iran, a country of 85 million people sitting on the northeastern edge of the Middle East, a nation with one of the oldest civilizations in human history, a civilization that was already ancient when Rome was still a village, a country that in 1979 went through one of the most dramatic revolutions of the 20th century, overthrowing a Western-backed king and replacing his government with an Islamic republic built on Shia Islam, a version of the faith that puts Iran in a category completely separate from Saudi Arabia. Now here's where it gets deep. Sunni and Shia Islam both trace back to the same prophet, the same holy book, the same fundamental faith. But they split over a single question more than 1,400 years ago. Who was the rightful leader of the Muslim world after the Prophet Muhammad died? That split created two communities. And over centuries, those two communities built different traditions, different rituals, different political ideas. And when Saudi Arabia and Iran both decided they wanted to lead the Muslim world in the modern era, that ancient split became a loaded weapon. But here is something important to understand, because this is where many people get it wrong. This conflict is not simply a religious war. Religion is the flag they both carry. The real competition is about power, about oil, about territory, about who controls the sea lanes, the trade routes, the governments, the armies, and the populations of the Middle East. Religion gives both sides a story to tell their followers. But underneath that story, the competition is geopolitical. It is strategic. It is cold and calculated. And that is exactly why experts call it a Cold War. The original Cold War was between the United States and the Soviet Union. They never directly fought each other with their own armies. Instead, they fought through proxy countries, funding one side in Vietnam, backing a coup in Chile, arming rebels in Afghanistan. The logic was simple: fight your enemy everywhere except face-to-face, because a direct war between nuclear powers would destroy everything. The new Middle East, Cold War, works on exactly the same logic. Saudi Arabia and Iran know that a direct war between them would be catastrophic. So instead, they fight each other through every weak state, every civil war, every political vacuum they can find. They arm proxy groups, they fund political parties, they train militias, they send weapons through smuggling routes. And in every single country where they do this, ordinary people pay with their lives. Now let's look at the map. Let's go country by country, battleground by battleground, and understand exactly how this proxy war is being played out across the geography of the Middle East. Start with Yemen. If you look at a map of the Arabian Peninsula, Yemen sits at the very bottom of it, right at the southern tip of Saudi Arabia. It is Saudi Arabia's backyard, literally on its border. And for Saudi Arabia, a hostile Yemen is not just an inconvenience, it is an existential threat, because Yemen controls the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, a narrow stretch of water that connects the Red Sea to the Gulf of Aden. Every single day, millions of barrels of oil pass through that strait on their way to Europe and Asia. Whoever controls Yemen can threaten that passage. Whoever controls Yemen can hold a knife to the throat of global oil markets. In 2014, a rebel group called the Houthis swept down from the mountains of northern Yemen and captured the capital city of Sana'a. The Houthis follow a branch of Shia Islam, and they have been receiving weapons, training, and support from Iran. From Saudi Arabia's point of view, this was Iran placing an armed militia directly on its southern border. It was Iran reaching into the Arabian Peninsula itself, the very heart of the Sunni world, the home of the holy cities, and planting a flag. Saudi Arabia responded by launching a military coalition in March 2015. They called it Operation Decisive Storm. The goal was simple: push the Houthis back, restore the internationally recognized Yemeni government, and remove Iranian influence from their border. 10 years later, the war is still going. The Houthis are still there. And Yemen has become the worst humanitarian disaster on the planet. Over 21 million people, Nearly 70% of the entire country need humanitarian assistance to survive. Entire cities have been reduced to rubble. Children are dying of starvation in a country that once fed itself. And the proxy war grinds on. But the Houthis did not just sit back and absorb punishment. They fought back with weapons that Iran had spent years smuggling to them: ballistic missiles, attack drones, anti-ship missiles. In 2019, they launched a drone and missile attack on Saudi Arabia's Abqaiq oil processing facility, the single most important oil facility on Earth, responsible for processing roughly 5% of the entire world's daily oil supply. The attack knocked out half of Saudi Arabia's oil production overnight. Oil prices spiked around the world. It was a message. Iran was telling Saudi Arabia, "We can reach inside your borders anytime we want. Your most critical infrastructure is not safe." And it did not stop there. Between 2023 and 2025, the Houthis began launching attacks on commercial ships in the Red Sea, targeting vessels they claimed had links to Israel during the Gaza War. They fired ballistic missiles at Israel itself, launching 28 missiles between March and May of 2025 alone. A rebel group sitting in one of the poorest countries on Earth was now firing long-range ballistic missiles at one of the most advanced militaries in the region. That is what Iranian weapons, training, and strategic guidance had made possible. Yemen shows you exactly how this Cold War works. Iran finds a willing group. It arms them, trains them, gives them a strategic purpose, and suddenly a civil conflict inside a poor country becomes a front line in a regional war. Now move north on the map. Move up the Arabian Peninsula, cross into the Gulf, and look at the small island nation of Bahrain. Bahrain sits in the Persian Gulf, connected to Saudi Arabia by a single causeway, the King Fahd Causeway, that you can drive across in about 30 minutes. It is physically attached to Saudi Arabia. And here is the crucial detail. Bahrain's population is majority Shia Muslim, but its government, the royal family that rules it, is Sunni. In 2011, when the Arab Spring swept through the Middle East and people took to the streets demanding rights and reform, Bahrain's Shia majority came out in enormous numbers. They gathered in Pearl Roundabout in the capital Manama. They called for political reform. Some called for the end of the monarchy entirely. Saudi Arabia looked at this and saw not a popular movement for democracy. It saw an Iranian hand. It saw the possibility that Iran was using Bahrain's Shia population to destabilize a country that sits 30 minutes from Saudi Arabia's eastern province, the same eastern province where most of Saudi Arabia's oil is located, and where Saudi Arabia's own Shia minority also lives. Saudi Arabia sent tanks across the causeway. The protests were crushed. The Arab Spring in Bahrain ended not with reform, but with security forces and armored vehicles. To this day, Bahrain remains a simmering fault line, a place where the demographic reality of a Shia majority ruled by a Sunni monarchy, propped up by Saudi military muscle, sits on top of constant tension. Now look further north. Cross the Persian Gulf and you reach Iraq. This is one of the most important pieces of the map, possibly the most important single piece of the entire Cold War geography. Iraq shares a long border with both Iran and Kuwait. It sits between the Persian Gulf and Turkey. It controls major oil fields. And since the American invasion in 2003, it has become the most contested piece of real estate in the entire Middle East. Here's what happened. When the United States invaded Iraq in 2003 and removed Saddam Hussein from power, it shattered the entire political structure of the country. Saddam had been a Sunni ruler governing a majority Shia country. When he fell, the Shia majority came to power for the first time in generations. And Iran, a Shia country right next door, saw its greatest strategic opportunity in decades. Iran moved fast and moved smart. It built relationships with Iraqi Shia political parties. It funded and armed Shia militias that became powerful enough to be called a state within a state. Iran had turned Iraq's internal politics into a weapon. It had inserted itself so deeply into Iraqi society, economy, and security that removing Iranian influence from Iraq today would be like trying to remove salt from the ocean. Saudi Arabia watched this happen and felt something close to panic. Iraq had historically been a buffer between Saudi Arabia and Iran, a Sunni-ruled Arab country that kept Persian and Shia influence at bay. Now that buffer was gone, now Iraq was tilting toward Tehran. And for Saudi Arabia, this was a nightmare scenario. A map where Iran had influence stretching from Tehran through Iraq, through Syria, all the way to the Mediterranean Sea. Which brings us to Syria. Syria is where this Cold War became the most visible and the most brutal. The Syrian civil war began in 2011, also during the Arab Spring, when protests against President Bashar al-Assad turned into a full-scale armed uprising. Assad belongs to the Alawite sect, a branch of Islam connected to Shia, and he had been a key partner of Iran for decades. Syria was Iran's bridge to Lebanon. Through Syrian territory, Iran could move weapons, fighters, and money to Hezbollah, the powerful Shia militia in Lebanon that is arguably Iran's most valuable proxy of all. Iran could not afford to lose Assad. If Assad fell, the entire chain connecting Iran to the Mediterranean would snap. So Iran went all in. It sent the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, Iran's most elite military force, to fight inside Syria. It sent Hezbollah fighters from Lebanon. It coordinated with Russian forces when Russia joined the war in 2015. Together, they kept Assad in power through years of fighting that killed hundreds of thousands of people and displaced more than half of Syria's entire population. Saudi Arabia and the other Gulf states backed the rebel groups fighting to remove Assad. They poured money and weapons into the opposition. But they were fighting on a battlefield where Iran was more committed, more organized, and more willing to sacrifice. The pro-Assad forces held. The rebel advance was pushed back. And then, in December 2024, something that nobody fully predicted happened. After years of seemingly frozen conflict, rebel forces launched a stunning offensive. City after city fell. Assad's army collapsed faster than anyone expected. And in days, not weeks, not months, the Assad government fell. Bashar al-Assad fled to Russia. For Iran, this was a catastrophic loss. In a single week, Iran lost its land bridge to the Mediterranean. Its supply route to Hezbollah was cut. Its most important Arab ally was gone. The investment of billions of dollars and thousands of lives evaporated. The map of Iranian influence suddenly had a massive hole in the middle of it. Now go west from Syria, across the border into Lebanon. Lebanon is one of the most complex countries in the world, a small nation of barely 5 million people that has been torn apart by sectarian politics, foreign interference, and civil war for decades. And Lebanon is home to Hezbollah. Hezbollah was born in the early 1980s with direct Iranian support in the chaos following Israel's invasion of Lebanon. It started as a resistance movement. Over 40 years, it became something far more powerful. A political party with ministers in the Lebanese government, a social service network that built hospitals and schools, and a military force with more rockets and missiles than most of the countries in the Middle East. Hezbollah has been called a state within a state, and its relationship with Iran is not just support. It is strategic partnership. Hezbollah is the crown jewel of Iran's proxy network. It is the one proxy that has genuinely changed the military balance of the region. For Israel, Hezbollah is the primary threat on its northern border. For Saudi Arabia, Hezbollah represents Iranian power sitting on the Mediterranean, capable of opening a front against Israel and destabilizing Lebanon's fragile government simultaneously. For Iran, Hezbollah is the most powerful card in its hand, a force that gives Iran the ability to threaten Israel without Iranian soldiers ever having to cross a border. But in 2024, the card was played, and it cost Iran enormously. During the war in Gaza, Hezbollah opened fire on northern Israel, forcing the evacuation of tens of thousands of Israelis from their homes. Israel responded with targeted strikes that killed Hezbollah's top military commanders. Then, in a devastating intelligence operation, Israel managed to compromise the communications devices of Hezbollah operatives across Lebanon, simultaneous explosions that killed and wounded thousands. The decapitation campaign continued. Hezbollah's Secretary General, Hassan Nasrallah, who had led the organization for over 3 decades and turned it into the most powerful non-state armed force in the world, was killed in an Israeli airstrike in Beirut. Iran's most valuable proxy had been devastated, not destroyed, but bled badly. Northern Lebanon became quiet in a way it had not been in years. And Iran suddenly found itself looking at a map where its most powerful tool had been blunted, its Syrian land bridge had been severed, and its axis of resistance, the network of proxies it had spent decades building, was in the worst shape of its existence. And this is the moment where we need to zoom out and look at the bigger picture, because this Cold War is not just about Saudi Arabia and Iran. The more you zoom out, the more players you see on this map. Israel is now a central actor in the geometry of this conflict. For decades, Israel and the Arab Gulf states were theoretically enemies, divided by the Palestinian question. But the common threat of Iranian power changed the math. Saudi Arabia and Israel, enemies on paper, began sharing intelligence, coordinating strategies, and eventually, in 2020, the Abraham Accords brought the UAE, Bahrain, Sudan, and Morocco into formal diplomatic relations with Israel. Saudi Arabia had not signed by the time the Gaza War began in October 2023, but the normalization talks were advanced. The idea of a formal Saudi-Israeli peace deal, unthinkable even a decade ago, was becoming a realistic possibility. And then Hamas attacked Israel on October 7th, 2023, and the entire region shifted again. The attack killed over 1,200 Israelis in a single day, the deadliest day for Jewish people since the Holocaust. It came from Gaza, the Palestinian coastal strip that Hamas had controlled since 2007. Hamas, like Hezbollah, received support from Iran. On October 7th, Iran's proxies struck at the heart of Israeli society in a way that shocked the entire world. Israel's response was a full-scale military campaign in Gaza that continued for over a year, killing tens of thousands of Palestinians and reducing large parts of Gaza to ruins. The war in Gaza did not just affect Israel and the Palestinians. It reverberated across the entire Cold War map. It activated Hezbollah in Lebanon. It triggered Houthi missile launches from Yemen. It brought Iranian-backed militias in Iraq back into action, targeting American bases in the region with drone and rocket attacks. Iran's axis of resistance tried to use the Gaza War to coordinate pressure on Israel from multiple directions simultaneously, a strategy Iran called the unity of fronts. For ordinary people watching the news, it was almost impossible to keep track of it all. A missile fired from Yemen at a ship in the Red Sea, a drone strike on an American base in Iraq, an explosion in Beirut, a clash on the Syrian border. Each event seemed separate, disconnected, but they were not separate. They were all threads of the same web, a web that Iran had been weaving for decades, pulling together distant conflicts into a single, coordinated strategy designed to surround Israel, exhaust Saudi Arabia, and push American power out of the region. That is what made the axis of resistance more than just a slogan. It was a doctrine, a map of interconnected fronts. And for a brief window of time in late 2023 and into 2024, it looked like that doctrine might actually work. But the unified pressure came at enormous cost. Each front that opened gave Israel and its allies reasons to strike back harder. The decapitation of Hezbollah leadership, the shattering of Hamas's military command structure, the fall of Assad, removing Iran's Syrian bridge. And then, in June 2025, Israel and the United States launched a 12-day campaign of airstrikes directly against Iran, hitting its ballistic missile program, its nuclear facilities, and key military installations. It was the most direct military confrontation between Iran and external powers in the entire history of the Islamic Republic. Iran emerged from those 12 days bloodied. Its nuclear program was set back, its military infrastructure was damaged. Its prestige, the image of untouchable revolutionary power it had spent decades cultivating, had taken a severe hit. This is where Turkey enters the story. Turkey has been one of the most important and most underestimated players on the new Middle East Cold War map. Turkey sits at the intersection of Europe and Asia. It controls the Bosphorus Strait, the narrow waterway connecting the Black Sea to the Mediterranean, through which Russia's naval forces must pass. It is a member of NATO. It has the second largest army in NATO. And its president, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, has spent years positioning Turkey as an independent power, not aligned with either the Saudi-led Sunni camp or the Iranian Shia axis, but pursuing its own strategic interests wherever they lead. In Syria, Turkey backed rebel groups against Assad. In Libya, Turkey sent military forces and drones. In the South Caucasus, Turkey backed Azerbaijan in its conflict with Armenia. In Somalia, Turkey has military bases and training missions. In Qatar, Turkey deployed troops to protect the tiny, gas-rich emirate when Saudi Arabia blockaded it in 2017. Turkey has become a power that everybody needs and nobody fully trusts. After the fall of Assad in December 2024, Turkey emerged as arguably the biggest winner in Syria. The rebel groups that took Damascus had direct ties to Turkish intelligence. The new Syrian government was friendly to Ankara, and suddenly Turkey, with its military presence in northern Syria and its relationships with the new Syrian leadership, had become the dominant external power in a country where Iran had just lost everything. Analysts began talking about a new triangular power structure taking shape in the Middle East. On one point, Israel, rebuilt and militarily dominant after defeating Iran's proxies. On another point, the Gulf states, led by Saudi Arabia and the UAE, flush with oil money and increasingly assertive militarily and diplomatically. And on the third point, Turkey, expanding its footprint from Libya to Syria to the Horn of Africa. Between these 3 points, broadly aligned and broadly backed by Washington, the map of Middle Eastern power was being redrawn, and Iran, weakened, isolated, its proxies damaged, its nuclear program under threat, was looking at a future very different from the one it had planned. Now let's bring in the global powers. Because no regional Cold War happens in a vacuum, and because the economic geography of this conflict is just as important as the military geography, and almost nobody talks about it, the Persian Gulf is not just a body of water. It is the financial heart of the global oil economy. Every single day, roughly 20% of the world's entire oil supply, 20% of everything that powers cars, planes, factories, and power stations across the planet, passes through the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow choke point at the mouth of the Persian Gulf. The strait is only about 33 kilometers wide at its narrowest point, and Iran sits on the northern shore of it. This geography has given Iran an enormous card to play. For decades, whenever tensions rise, Iranian officials remind the world that they have the capability to close the Strait of Hormuz. They have not done it, because doing so would also cut off Iran's own oil exports and invite an immediate military response from the United States. But the threat alone is enough to move oil markets. The threat alone is enough to make every Gulf state nervous. The geography of oil is inseparable from the geography of this Cold War. Saudi Arabia has responded to this geographic vulnerability by investing in pipeline infrastructure that can route oil without going through the strait. but nothing fully replaces the capacity of Hormuz. And so the strait remains one of the most important pieces of real estate in the world. A 33-kilometer wide choke point where the geography of energy, the geography of geopolitics, and the geography of military power all converge in one place. The Gulf states themselves, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, Qatar, Bahrain, and Oman, are not a monolithic bloc. They have different relationships with Iran, different relationships with the United States, and different ideas about how to manage the regional competition. Qatar, for example, shares the world's largest natural gas field with Iran, the North Dome field on the Qatari side, the South Pars field on the Iranian side. Qatar and Iran have maintained a working relationship out of sheer geographic and economic necessity, even while Qatar hosts the largest American airbase in the Middle East at Al Udeid. The UAE has taken an increasingly independent path. In 2021, the UAE signed a ceasefire agreement with the Houthis in Yemen and began withdrawing from the Saudi-led coalition, prioritizing economic stability and trade over continued military commitment. The UAE's economy is deeply integrated with global trade through the port of Jebel Ali, the busiest port in the entire Middle East and one of the busiest in the world. The UAE does not want war. It wants business. And business requires stability, which sometimes means talking to Iran, talking to the Houthis, and not following Riyadh's lead on every decision. This divergence within the Gulf Cooperation Council is itself part of the story. The Saudi-led camp is not perfectly unified. Iran has been skilled at finding the cracks, at using Qatar's gas relationship, at using Oman's historical role as a quiet back channel, at using the UAE's commercial interests to prevent a fully unified front against Iranian influence. The United States has been the dominant external power in the Middle East for decades. American military bases dot the map from Qatar to Kuwait to Bahrain to Djibouti. The Fifth Fleet, the American naval force that patrols the Persian Gulf and the Arabian Sea, is headquartered in Manama, Bahrain. American troops are in Iraq, Syria, Jordan, and across the Gulf. And American military power remains the ultimate backstop for the Saudi-led order in the region. But American commitment to the region has become increasingly complicated. The Iraq War cost trillions of dollars and thousands of American lives, and ended with Iran more influential in Baghdad than the United States. The American public grew tired of Middle Eastern wars. The rise of American domestic oil production through shale technology reduced America's strategic dependence on Gulf oil. Every American president since Barack Obama has tried to find a way to reduce American military exposure in the Middle East. None has fully succeeded, because every time they pull back, a crisis pulls them back in. Russia, meanwhile, moved into the space that American hesitation created. When Russia intervened in Syria in 2015, it was the first time Russian military forces had operated in the Middle East since the end of the Cold War. Russia was not there just for Assad. Russia was there to show the world that America's word was not final, that there was another great power willing to protect its allies and project force. Russia gained a naval base at Tartus in Syria, its only Mediterranean port. And Russia gained enormous diplomatic leverage, inserting itself as an indispensable player in any negotiation about Syria's future. But Russia's war in Ukraine, launched in February 2022, stretched its military and its economy to the limit. Russia became more dependent on Iran for weapons, buying Iranian drones and missiles to use against Ukraine. The relationship between Russia and Iran deepened, and this created a strange dynamic where Iran, weakened regionally, found itself bound more tightly to a Russia that was itself under enormous pressure. And then there is China. China has been quietly, steadily, patiently expanding its presence in the Middle East for years. It is the largest buyer of Saudi oil. It is one of the largest buyers of Iranian oil, buying it in defiance of American sanctions. Chinese construction companies are building infrastructure across the Gulf, across Iraq, across Iran. The Belt and Road Initiative, China's trillion-dollar infrastructure investment program, runs directly through the Middle East. And in March 2023, China did something remarkable. It brokered a diplomatic agreement between Saudi Arabia and Iran. After years of severed diplomatic relations that had been cut in 2016 when an Iranian mob attacked Saudi diplomatic missions, after Saudi Arabia executed a prominent Shia cleric, the two countries agreed to restore ties under Chinese mediation. It was a signal that China was not just an economic player anymore. It was becoming a diplomatic broker. It was inserting itself into the architecture of Middle Eastern stability in a way the United States had always claimed as its exclusive domain. The agreement did not end the rivalry. The proxy wars did not stop. The underlying competition for regional dominance did not disappear. But it showed that the global context of the Middle East Cold War was shifting. America was no longer the only outside power with the ability to shape regional outcomes. China was at the table. Now step back and look at the full map one more time. Look at what this geography tells us. The battlefields of the new Middle East Cold War form a crescent. Start at Yemen in the south, where the Houthis fight Saudi forces and fire missiles across the Red Sea, move up to the waters of the Persian Gulf, where naval standoffs, tanker seizures, and proxy tensions simmer. Cross into Iraq, where Iranian-backed militias coexist uneasily with an Iraqi government trying to balance between Washington and Tehran. Move into Syria, where the fall of Assad reshuffled the entire board. Continue to Lebanon, where Hezbollah, damaged but not destroyed, is trying to rebuild amid a political and economic collapse that has made Lebanon one of the most broken countries in the world. And finally arrive at Gaza and Israel, where the most explosive front of the entire conflict has been burning since October 2023. This crescent of conflict is not random. Every single point on it is a place where Iranian influence and Saudi-led, Western-backed power have collided. Every single point is a place where a local grievance, Yemeni poverty, Iraqi sectarianism, Syrian dictatorship, Lebanese dysfunction, Palestinian statelessness, has been seized upon, amplified, and weaponized by the regional powers competing for dominance. That is what makes this Cold War so dangerous and so difficult to end. The local causes are real. The people fighting these wars have genuine grievances, genuine identities, genuine reasons for taking up arms. Iran and Saudi Arabia did not create those grievances, but they found them and they poured fuel on them. They gave money, weapons, and strategic direction to the fires that were already burning, and now the fires have consumed entire countries. And here is the deepest truth of all. Neither Iran nor Saudi Arabia has actually won. After more than a decade of this Cold War, after all the money spent and all the lives lost, the Middle East map is not under the control of either side. Saudi Arabia could not crush the Houthis on its own border. Iran lost Syria, lost significant Hezbollah capability, and had its nuclear program bombed. The countries caught in between, Yemen, Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon, have been devastated. Their economies are in ruins. Their populations are scattered across the world as refugees. Their futures have been mortgaged to pay for someone else's strategic competition. This is what proxy wars always do. The great powers fight each other to the last drop of someone else's blood. The Cold War between America and the Soviet Union gave the world wars in Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, Angola, Nicaragua, and dozens of other places where local people died in enormous numbers while the two superpowers maneuvered from a safe distance. The new Middle East Cold War has followed exactly the same pattern. The people of Yemen, Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, and Gaza have paid the price for competition between Riyadh and Tehran. But the geography is shifting. The map is being redrawn. The fall of Assad was a turning point. The damage to Hezbollah was a turning point. The Abraham Accords were a turning point. Turkey's rise was a turning point. China's arrival as a diplomatic broker was a turning point. And the direct strikes on Iran in 2025 were perhaps the biggest turning point of all. Because for the first time, the confrontation between Iran and its opponents went beyond proxies and became direct. What comes next is the question that every strategic analyst in the world is trying to answer right now. Will Iran, weakened and isolated, decide to double down, accelerate its nuclear program, rebuild its proxies, and fight harder? Or will it look at the map and decide that the cost of the Cold War is too high, that survival of the Islamic Republic matters more than regional dominance? Will Saudi Arabia consolidate its gains and push for a new regional order? Will Turkey fill the vacuum left by Iran in Syria? Will China use its new diplomatic role to broker a wider settlement? Will the United States stay engaged or continue its slow retreat? Nobody knows the answers to these questions yet. History is still being written. The geography of the new Middle East Cold War is still shifting under our feet. But here is what we do know. The Middle East is not a region of ancient hatreds that cannot be changed. It is a region of real people, real nations, real interests. People who want what everyone else wants. Safety, stability, a future for their children, a chance to live without fear of the next missile, the next militia, the next foreign power deciding that their country is a useful piece on somebody else's strategic chessboard. The new Middle East Cold War has cost those people enormously. Understanding its geography, understanding why Yemen matters, why Iraq matters, why Syria matters, why Lebanon matters, why all of these places are connected to each other and to the competition between two rival visions of what the Middle East should be, is the first step toward understanding what it would take to end it. And maybe, just maybe, understanding it clearly enough, honestly enough, is also the first step toward demanding something better.